Commander Daniel Harper stood in the massive council chamber and felt the weight of 17 different alien species staring down at him from their elevated seats, and the room smelled strange like metal and something sweet he could not identify, and the lights were too bright for human eyes, but he kept his face calm and professional, because this moment would decide everything for humanity and their future among the stars, and he had practiced his speech 100 times. But now that he was here, the words felt small and inadequate against the vastness of what they were asking for. The Galactic Trade Consortium controlled every major shipping route between inhabited worlds, and without access to these routes, humanity would remain isolated on their small cluster of colonies and forever dependent on the goodwill of other species for basic supplies and advanced technology. And Daniel was here to change that and to bring his species into the galactic community, as equals rather than beggars. The Xanthari ambassador spoke first, and his voice came through the translator as sharp and cutting, and he was a tall being with blue-gray skin and 4 arms and eyes that never seemed to blink, and he looked at Daniel the way someone might look at an insect and asked why the council should waste their time with another primitive species that barely understood faster than light. Daniel kept his voice steady and explained that humanity had much to offer, and that they had survived and thrived in conditions that would have destroyed other species, and that their adaptability and innovative thinking could benefit the entire consortium, and he talked about human achievements in medicine and engineering and mathematics. But he could see that most of the council members were not impressed and had heard similar claims from dozens of hopeful species before. The Velthine matriarch, Selah, leaned forward in her seat, and her scaled face was unreadable, and her species was known for their cold calculation and perfect memory. And she asked a simple question that cut through all of Daniel's prepared arguments, and she wanted to know if humanity could prove their worth, rather than simply claim it. Daniel felt his heart rate increase, but he nodded and said that humanity was willing to prove themselves through any reasonable test, and that they understood respect must be earned, and the council chamber fell silent for a moment. And then several council members began, speaking at once in their various languages, and the translator struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations. Finally, the Xanthari ambassador raised one of his 4 hands, and the chamber quieted, and he smiled. But it was not a friendly expression, and he said that the council had a traditional test for species seeking full membership, and it was called the Trial of Passage, and only species that completed this trial successfully could join the consortium as full trading partners. The trial required a single ship to navigate through a region of space known as the Void Breach, and this was an area where 3 black holes orbited each other in a complex dance, and their gravitational fields created a constantly shifting maze of deadly forces, and no computer could predict the patterns because they changed too quickly. And any ship that entered had to rely on real-time navigation and quick decisions and perfect execution. Daniel felt a cold sensation in his stomach because he had heard stories about the Void Breach and how it had destroyed dozens of ships over the centuries, and the last species to attempt the passage had lost their finest vessel and their most experienced crew. And that had been over 200 years ago, and since then, no one had been foolish enough or brave enough to try. The council gave humanity their terms, and they could send 1 ship crewed only by humans, with no alien technology beyond what they had developed themselves, and no assistance from other species during the attempt, and if they succeeded, then humanity would gain full membership and access to all trade routes and technology-sharing agreements. And if they failed, then humanity must wait 50 standard years before they could apply again. Daniel asked how long they had to prepare, and the Xanthari ambassador laughed and said they had 1 week to decide if they would accept the challenge, and then 72 hours to prepare once they committed, and the council was not interested in waiting years for humanity to build a special ship or train a special crew, and either humanity was ready now, or they were not ready at all. The other council members watched Daniel carefully and waited for him to back down or ask for more time or make excuses, and this was clearly a test within the test, and they wanted to see how humans responded to impossible pressure and whether they would accept a challenge that seemed designed to make them fail. Daniel thought about the colony ships waiting in orbit and the millions of humans living on worlds that could barely support them without better trade access, and he thought about the children growing up on those worlds and what kind of future they would have if humanity remained isolated and cut off from the galactic community, and he thought about the crew of the FSS Horizon and whether he had the right to ask them to risk everything on such a dangerous mission. But he also thought about what it meant to be human and how his species had always done the impossible and had walked on their moon when everyone said it could not be done, and had split the atom and cured diseases and survived wars and disasters that should have destroyed them, and maybe that was what the Council really wanted to see, and whether humanity still had that spark of stubborn determination that refused to accept defeat. Daniel looked up at the 17 species and met their eyes one by one, and said that humanity accepted the challenge and would attempt the trial of passage, and the council chamber erupted in surprised murmurs, and several council members seemed shocked that he had agreed so quickly, and the Zinthari ambassador leaned back in his seat, and his expression was hard to read, but might have been respect, or might have been satisfaction at trapping humanity into an impossible situation. The formal proceedings took another hour as the council recorded humanity's acceptance and explained the exact rules and boundaries of the trial, and Daniel signed documents that he barely read because his mind was already racing ahead to the horizon and how he would tell his crew what they had just committed to and whether they would understand why he had said yes without consulting them first. When the council finally dismissed him, Daniel walked back through the station corridors in a daze, and other species moved out of his way, and some watched him with curiosity, and others with pity, and he heard whispers in languages he did not understand. But the tone was clear enough, and they thought humanity had just signed their own death warrant. He reached the docking bay where the FSS Horizon waited, and the ship looked solid and dependable, and it had carried colonists across vast distances and had never failed in its mission, but it had never been designed for combat or for navigating deadly gravitational anomalies. And Daniel wondered if he had just condemned his crew to die in the cold darkness between black holes. But when he boarded the ship and called his senior officers to the briefing room and told them what had happened and what the council demanded, something unexpected occurred, and instead of fear or anger, he saw determination in their eyes. And Lisa Morgan, his chief engineer, grinned and said it was about time someone gave them a real challenge, and Jake Peterson, his navigator, started pulling up data on the void breach before Daniel even finished explaining, and Amy Collins, his science officer, was already running calculations on gravitational patterns. They did not ask if they should attempt the trial, and they did not suggest looking for a way out, and they simply started working on how to succeed. And Daniel realized that maybe he had not made the decision alone after all, and maybe he had known deep down that his crew would respond exactly this way because they were human, and humans did not back down from challenges just because they seemed impossible. Daniel made the announcement to the entire crew and explained what they would attempt and gave anyone who wanted to transfer off the ship permission to do so without prejudice, and not a single crew member left. And instead, they got to work with a focused intensity that Daniel had never seen before, and 72 hours suddenly seemed like both too much time and not nearly enough. The FSS Horizon had never been designed for what they were about to ask it to do, and the ship was built to carry colonists safely across long distances at steady speeds, and its systems were meant for reliability rather than performance. And now, they had 72 hours to transform it into something that could survive forces that had destroyed purpose-built military vessels, and the crew worked without sleep and pushed themselves beyond normal human limits because they understood that failure meant more than just their own deaths, and it meant humanity would remain isolated and weak for another 50 years. Lisa Morgan stood in the main engineering bay surrounded by holographic displays showing every system on the ship, and she had been staring at the same problem for 6 hours, and the problem was simple and impossible at the same time, and they needed to get through a gravitational maze that changed faster than any computer could calculate a safe path, and every other species had tried to overpower the forces or avoid them entirely, and every other species had failed. She called her engineering teams together and asked them to forget everything they knew about standard navigation and to think about the problem differently, and one of her junior engineers mentioned old Earth sailing ships and how they could move against the wind by tacking back and forth, and Lisa stopped and stared at him and suddenly saw the solution in her mind like a lightning flash. And they did not need to fight the gravitational forces, and they needed to use them like sailors use the wind, The gravitational dampeners on the horizon were designed to protect the crew from acceleration forces, but Lisa realized they could be modified to do something completely different. And they could act like sails that caught and redirected gravitational waves instead of just blocking them. And it would require rewiring half the ship and recalibrating every dampener individually. And they had less than 3 days to do it. But it was possible, and that was all that mattered. Her teams tore into the ship's systems with controlled fury and pulled out components that had been installed when the ship was built and replaced them with new configurations that existed only in Lisa's mind, and in the hasty diagram she drew on every available surface, and some of the modifications seemed crazy even to experienced engineers. But Lisa had a way of explaining things that made the impossible sound merely difficult, and her confidence was infectious and spread through the engineering teams. Like Fire Jake Peterson had a different problem to solve in the navigation department, and every previous attempt to cross the void. Breach had relied on plotting a course in advance and then following it as closely as possible, and this approach made sense to species that valued careful planning and precise execution. But Jake knew it was wrong because the gravitational fields changed too fast, and any pre-calculated route would be obsolete within seconds of entering the breach. He proposed something that made the other navigators nervous, and they would create an algorithm that calculated their route in real time based on sensor data, and the algorithm would make decisions 3 times per second and adjust their path constantly, and thread through gaps in the gravitational chaos that only existed for moments, and it meant giving up human control and trusting a computer to make life or death decisions faster than any human could react. The navigation team worked around the clock to build and test the algorithm, and they ran millions of simulations using every scrap of data that existed about the void breach. And the algorithm failed over and over again in the simulations and died in 1,000 different ways. But each failure taught them something new, and they refined the code and made it smarter and faster and more adaptable until finally it started, succeeding in the simulations more often than it failed. Amy Collins approached the challenge from a completely different angle in the science department, and she studied the old records of failed attempts and looked for patterns that others had missed, and most species had tried to rush through the void breach as quickly as possible because they wanted to minimize their exposure to the gravitational forces, and this seemed logical and obvious, and completely wrong. Amy discovered something subtle in the data, and the gravitational fluctuations were not random, even though they seemed chaotic, and there was a rhythm to them like a heartbeat or a drumbeat, and the pattern repeated every 17 seconds, but with variations that made it hard to detect, and previous attempts had missed this pattern because they were moving too fast and creating their own turbulence in the gravitational fields. She proposed they move slower through the breach and match their speed to the rhythm of the gravitational pulses, and this would create a kind of resonance that would stabilize the ship during the worst fluctuations. And it seemed insane to move slowly through the most dangerous region of space, but Amy's calculations showed it would work. And more importantly, it would work because humans understood rhythm in a way that other species did not. Dr. Kevin Richards had perhaps the hardest job, because he had to keep the crew alive and conscious during gravitational forces that would kill an unprepared human. And the ship's dampeners would help, but they could not eliminate all the forces. And the crew would experience acceleration that pushed the limits of human endurance. And if people passed out at the wrong moment, then everyone would die. He worked with the medical staff to develop a combination of medications that would keep blood flowing to the brain during high G forces and increase oxygen efficiency in the blood and prevent the small capillaries in the eyes from bursting under pressure. And the drug cocktail had never been tested under real conditions, and Kevin had no idea if it would work. But it was the best they could do with the time they had. He also developed a breathing technique based on fighter pilot training that would help the crew stay conscious during rapid acceleration changes, and he drilled every crew member on the technique until they could do it automatically without thinking. And some people complained that they had more important things to do than breathing exercises, but Kevin insisted and made them practice until their muscles remembered the rhythm. The modifications drew attention from other species on the council station, and several ambassadors asked permission to tour the horizon and observe the human preparations, and Daniel allowed it because refusing would seem like they had something to hide. And the visitors walked through the ship and watched the crew work, and most of them seemed amused or contemptuous at what they saw. The Xanthari ambassador Quarren toured the engineering sections and watched Lisa's teams install the modified dampeners, and he asked questions in a tone that made it clear he thought the whole approach was primitive and desperate, and he told Daniel that the modifications looked like something a child would design, and that humanity was wasting their time with improvised solutions when they needed advanced technology and precision engineering. Lisa overheard the comment and stopped working long enough to look Quarren in the eye and told him that sometimes the best solutions were simple ones, and that other species had failed because they overthought the problem and tried to use brute force, and Quarren laughed and walked away. But some of the crew members noticed that he looked back at Lisa with an expression that might have been uncertainty. Not everyone doubted the humans, and a young Corvani pilot named Thresh spent hours watching the navigation team work, and his people had lost a ship in the void breach 2 centuries ago, and that disaster had changed the Corvani from a bold species into a cautious one. And Thresh had grown up hearing stories about his ancestor who had died in the attempt and how the failure had shamed the entire Corvani empire. He saw something in the human approach that reminded him of the old stories about his people before they became afraid, and the humans were not cautious or careful, and they were bold and creative and willing to try solutions that other species would dismiss as too risky, and Thresh found himself hoping the humans would succeed, even though his government had bet against them. The final hours before launch were chaos and controlled panic, and 1,000 small problems that threatened to become major disasters, and a cooling system failed and had to be replaced, and a primary sensor array stopped working, and had to be rebuilt from spare parts, and 3 crew members got injured in accidents, caused by exhaustion, and had to be treated and cleared for duty, and Daniel barely slept and moved through the ship like a ghost, and checked on every department, and made sure his people had what they needed. Lisa finished the last dampener modification, with 4 hours to spare, and then immediately collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried to medical bay, and she woke up 2 hours later, and insisted on running final tests on all her systems, and the tests showed that everything worked. But there was no way to know if it would work under real conditions until they were in the breach. With no chance to turn back, Jake completed the navigation algorithm with 90 minutes before launch and immediately started second-guessing every decision he had made, and Daniel found him staring at the code and asked if it would work. And Jake said honestly that he did not know. But it was better than anything else they had, and sometimes that had to be enough. Amy triple-checked her calculations about the gravitational rhythm and found a small error that would have thrown off their timing by 0.3 seconds, and 0.3 seconds did not sound like much, but in the void. The moment the FSS Horizon crossed into the void breach, every sensor on the ship screamed warnings, and the view screen showed a nightmare of twisted space, where light bent in impossible directions, and stars appeared in places they should not be, and the gravitational forces hit the ship like a physical blow, and threw everyone against their restraints. And Daniel heard someone cry out in pain, but could not turn his head to see who it was, because the acceleration was too strong. The ship lurched sideways as a gravitational wave caught them from an unexpected angle, and then dropped as another force pulled them down, and the dampeners were working but barely, and the crew experienced forces that made their bones ache and their vision blur, and Kevin's medication kept them conscious, but it could not eliminate the pain. And Daniel forced himself to breathe using the technique Kevin had taught them, and felt his vision clear slightly as oxygen reached his brain. Lisa watched her engineering displays and saw the stress indicators climbing into dangerous territory across every system, and the hull was flexing in ways it was not designed for, and she could hear the metal groaning even over the sound of alarms. And she started adjusting the dampener configurations in real time and tried to anticipate the gravitational waves before they hit and turn them from threats into advantages. The modified dampeners caught a massive wave that came from the direction of the first black hole, and instead of trying to block the force, Lisa used it to push the ship in a new direction, and the Horizon rode the gravitational current like a surfer on a wave, and gained speed and changed course in a way that seemed to defy the laws of physics, and for a moment the crew felt weightless before the next wave hit them. Jake's hands moved across the navigation controls faster than conscious thought, and the algorithm was feeding him instructions every 3 seconds and showing him paths through the chaos that appeared and disappeared in moments. and he had to trust the computer completely because there was no time to second-guess or verify, and he just reacted and adjusted the ship's course and fired thrusters in combinations that would have seemed random to anyone watching, but were actually threading them through impossible gaps. Emmy called out the rhythm of the gravitational pulses, and her voice was steady despite the forces trying to crush her chest, and she counted the beats like a metronome, and Jake used her timing to synchronize their movements with the natural flow of the breach, and it was working, and the ship was moving through spaces that should have killed them, and surviving forces that should have torn them apart. The first hour was brutal beyond anything they had imagined in training, and 6 crew members were injured when a sudden acceleration shift threw them against bulkheads, despite their restraints, and one of the main sensor arrays failed completely and went dark, and a thruster on the port side overheated and had to be shut down before it exploded, and Lisa had to recalculate all her dampener settings to compensate for the lost thruster, and the ship started pulling slightly. To one side on the council station, thousands of beings watched the live transmission and saw the horizon struggling through the breach, and most of them expected to see the ship destroyed at any moment, and the Zenthari ambassador sat rigid in his seat and watched without speaking. And the Veltine matriarch leaned forward with an intensity that surprised her aides, and Thresh, the young Corvani, was gripping his chair with all 4 hands and breathing in time with Amy's rhythm as if he could somehow help the humans by matching their timing. The second hour was worse because the crew was already exhausted, and the medication Kevin had given them was starting to wear off, and people's reactions were slowing, and several crew members started hallucinating from the stress and the constant acceleration and deceleration, and Kevin moved through the ship as quickly as he could, and administered second doses of medication, and checked on injured crew, and kept people focused and conscious. Daniel felt time stretching and compressing in strange ways, and minutes felt like hours, and then suddenly seconds would pass in a blur, and he did not know if this was a real effect of the gravitational forces or just his brain struggling to process what was happening, and he forced himself to stay focused on the immediate moment and trust his crew to do their jobs, because there was nothing else he could do. Lisa's modifications proved their worth over and over as the gravitational sails caught waves that would have destroyed the ship and turned them into momentum and directional changes, and she was operating on pure instinct now and reading the gravitational patterns in the way a sailor reads the wind and making adjustments before. The sensors even registered the changes, and her teams in engineering followed her instructions without question because they had learned to trust her completely. Jake reached a state that fighter pilots called the zone where conscious thought disappeared, and he became one with the ship and the navigation system, and his hands moved automatically and made corrections that he did not remember deciding to make, and the algorithm fed him data, and he processed it and reacted, and the ship danced through the chaos in a way that seemed almost alive. Halfway through the breach, something went wrong in a way they had not anticipated, and a gravitational shear hit them from 2 directions at once, and the forces were perfectly balanced but opposite. And they created a twisting stress that the hull could not handle, and metal screamed and tore, and a section of the outer hull ripped open and exposed the engineering deck to vacuum, and the atmospheric breach alarms added their voice to the already deafening warnings. 3 engineers were on that deck when it happened, and Lisa saw their life signs on her display and watched them scramble for emergency suits, but the escaping atmosphere was too strong and pulled them toward the breach, and she had 3 seconds to make a decision. And if she sealed the section, she would trap them in a compartment that was losing air, and if she did not seal it, the breach would spread, and they would lose half the ship. Lisa hit the emergency seal command, and blast doors slammed shut and trapped the 3 engineers in the damage section, and she immediately started rerouting power to give them more time, but she knew it was not enough, and they had maybe 10 minutes of air left, and it would take at least 30 minutes to reach the far side of the breach, and she had just killed 3 members of her team. Daniel saw what happened on his command display and understood Lisa's decision and knew it was the right one and hated that it was the right one, and he opened a channel to the trapped engineers, and they were conscious and knew exactly what their situation was, and one of them spoke for all 3 and told Daniel not to slow down and not to risk the ship trying to save them, and to finish the run and make it mean something. The decision was taken out of his hands, but Daniel still had to give the order, and he told Lisa to maintain speed and focus on getting them through. and then he closed the channel because he could not listen to the trapped engineers and stay focused on command, and he would carry those voices with him for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. Nicole Barnes, the first officer, took over coordinating the rescue efforts, and she pulled together a team with cutting equipment, and they positioned themselves as close to the sealed section as they could get, and prepared to cut through the moment they exited the breach, and the team worked with desperate efficiency and sharpened their tools and planned their approach and tried not to think about whether the 3 engineers would still be alive when they got through. The ship pushed deeper into the breach, and the gravitational forces became so intense that the fabric of space itself seemed to warp and stretch, and the crew started experiencing temporal distortions, and time moved at different rates in different parts of the ship, and people in the forward sections aged seconds faster than people in the aft sections, and the differences were small but measurable and deeply disturbing. Amy's rhythm was the only constant, and she kept counting the gravitational pulses, and her voice was hoarse but steady, and the entire crew synchronized their breathing to her timing, and it helped them stay grounded and focused and reminded them that they were still human, and still alive and still fighting. The sensor displays showed they were approaching the worst part of the breach, and the point where all 3 black holes, gravitational fields converged and created forces that made everything they had experienced so far seem mild, and this was where every previous ship had been destroyed, and where the mathematics said no ship could survive, and where they would either prove the impossible or become another data point in the Council's records of failures. Lisa looked at her displays and saw something that made her heart race, and the 3 gravitational fields were fighting each other at the convergence point, and in that fight, they created tiny pockets of relative stability. And the pockets were small and lasted for less than a second each, but Jake's algorithm might be fast enough to use them, and if they could hit 3 pockets in sequence, they could slingshot through the convergence. She sent her calculations to Daniel and explained what they needed to do, and it was insane, and required shutting down the dampeners completely for 7 seconds and letting the ship fall into a controlled spin, and using the rotational momentum to carry them through the pockets, and the margin for error was 0. And if Jake's timing was off by even 1/10 of a second, the ship would be ripped into atoms. The FSS Horizon limped toward the Council station and left a trail of debris and vented atmosphere behind it, and emergency repair crews worked frantically to seal the worst hull breaches and stabilize systems that were moments from complete failure, and the ship looked like it should not be able to move at all, let alone navigate through the complex docking procedures. But somehow, it held together through sheer stubbornness and the will of its crew. Daniel sat in the command chair and felt every muscle in his body aching, and his hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. But he kept his voice steady as he coordinated with station traffic control and brought the Horizon in for docking, and the station had cleared an entire docking bay for them, and medical teams were standing by, and repair crews were already analyzing the damage and calculating what it would take to make the ship spaceworthy again. The docking clamps engaged with a solid thunk that reverberated through the hull, and for the first time in hours the crew felt truly safe, and several people started crying, and others just sat in stunned silence and tried to process what they had just survived. And Lisa slumped over her engineering console and closed her eyes and let herself feel the exhaustion she had been ignoring for the past 4 hours. Kevin moved through the ship and checked on every crew member and cataloged injuries and conditions, and 14 people needed immediate medical attention, beyond what his staff could provide, and the 3 trapped engineers were stable, but would need days of observation, and everyone showed signs of extreme physical stress and would need time to recover. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. The Council sent a delegation to verify the ship's passage through the void breach, and 3 independent inspectors boarded the Horizon and examined the sensor logs and recorded the damage and interviewed crew members, and their inspection was thorough and professional and took over 2 hours. But at the end, they had no choice but to certify that humanity had successfully completed the trial of Passage Daniel, and his senior officers prepared to walk to the Council chamber for the formal verification ceremony, and they showered and changed into clean uniforms, but there was no hiding the exhaustion in their faces or the way they moved like people who had aged years in a few hours. And as they left the ship and entered the station corridors, something unexpected happened. The corridors were lined with beings from dozens of different species, and as Daniel and his crew walked past these beings, stepped back and made gestures that their translators identified as signs of respect, and some species placed their hands over their hearts and others bowed slightly, and a few made complex gestures with multiple limbs that meant honor and recognition. The Zenthari ambassador Quarren was waiting in one of the side corridors, and he stepped forward and blocked Daniel's path, and for a moment Daniel thought there might be some kind of confrontation, but Quarren did something that surprised everyone, and he lowered all four of his hands in the Zenthari gesture of respect, and spoke in his own language, which the translator rendered as an apology. Quarren said that he had underestimated humanity and judged them by standards that were not fair, and that what the Horizon crew had accomplished was beyond courage, and touched something his people called the fire, which was the quality that made a being truly alive and truly worthy. And he had not seen the fire in another species for many years, and was honored to have witnessed it. Daniel did not know what to say, because he had expected contempt, or at best grudging acknowledgement but not genuine respect from someone who had clearly wanted them to fail. And he simply nodded and thanked Quarren, and the Zenthari ambassador stepped aside and let them pass. But Daniel noticed that Quarren fell into step behind them and followed them toward the council chamber. The council chamber was packed with more beings than Daniel had ever seen there, and apparently word had spread throughout the station, and everyone wanted to witness the formal verification, and the energy in the room was completely different from the first time Daniel had stood here. And where before there had been contempt and indifference, now there was curiosity and respect and genuine interest. The verification was brief and formal, and the inspectors presented their findings and certified that all conditions had been met, and the council members voted unanimously to grant humanity full membership in the Galactic Trade Consortium, and the vote was almost an anticlimax because everyone already knew the outcome, and the real story was what had happened in the Void Breach. But after the formal vote, something unprecedented occurred, and the Velthine matriarch Sela rose from her seat and requested permission to address the chamber, and she was one of the most powerful beings in the galactic community. And when she spoke, everyone listened. Sela said that her species had been part of the consortium for over 3,000 years, and in that time, they had seen hundreds of species join and dozens fail the various trials and tests, and in all those centuries, she had never seen a solution to a problem as elegant and innovative as what the humans had demonstrated, and that her people had grown stagnant because they relied too heavily on established methods and ancient knowledge. She proposed that the consortium establish a formal exchange program with humanity, where their engineers and scientists and navigators could work with human counterparts and learn from each other. And she specifically requested that Lisa Morgan be allowed to teach a seminar on adaptive engineering at the Premier Technical Institute, and that Jake Peterson share his navigation techniques with other species. Other council members immediately voiced their support, and within minutes there were a dozen formal requests for human expertise and cooperation. And Daniel realized that they had not just won membership, and they had won something far more valuable, which was the respect and genuine interest of the galactic community. The formal ceremony ended, but the conversations continued, and Daniel found himself surrounded by ambassadors and officials who wanted to ask questions about human methods and culture and thinking. And Lisa was cornered by a group of engineers who were fascinated by her gravitational sail concept, and Jake was demonstrating his navigation algorithm to a crowd of navigators from 6 different species. Amy was explaining the concept of rhythm and timing to a group of scientists who had never considered that biological intuition could be superior to mathematical precision in certain situations, and Kevin was discussing his medication cocktail and breathing techniques with medical officers who were amazed that such simple methods could enhance human performance so dramatically. Thresh, the young Corvani pilot, approached Daniel privately and asked permission to serve aboard a human ship for 1 year and learn their methods and their way of thinking, and he explained that his people had lost their courage 2 centuries ago when they failed the Void Breach and had become cautious and afraid, and he wanted to bring back the spirit of boldness and innovation that he had seen in the human crew. Daniel said he would need to check with his superiors, but that he would personally recommend Thresh for the program, and the young Corvani's face showed an emotion that the translator identified as joy mixed with determination, and Daniel saw in him the same qualities that made his own crew special, and realized that courage and innovation were not uniquely human traits, but rather universal qualities that some individuals possessed, regardless of species. Nicole found Daniel in a quiet corner of the station later that evening and told him that the 3 trapped engineers were awake and asking to see him, and Daniel went to the medical bay and stood beside their beds and did not know what to say because he had given the order that nearly killed them. But the engineers did not blame him, and they understood the decision and would have made the same choice in his position. And one of them said that being part of the crew that accomplished the impossible was worth any risk, and that their brief period of unconsciousness was a small price to pay for the future they had secured for humanity. And Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not realized he was carrying. The news of humanity's success spread through the galactic community faster than light-speed messages could travel, and within hours there were inquiries from dozens of species that wanted to establish trade relations and cultural exchanges and research partnerships, and the human colonies that had been struggling in isolation suddenly had more opportunities than they could handle. The Horizon's crew became instant celebrities and were invited to speak at universities and military academies and corporate conferences across the galaxy, and several of them accepted these invitations while others preferred to return to their duties. But all of them understood that their lives had changed forever, and that they would always be known as the crew that proved the impossible was possible. Lisa received funding offers from a dozen research institutes that wanted her to continue developing her adaptive engineering concepts, and she turned most of them down, but accepted a partnership with a Velthine research group that shared her enthusiasm for unconventional solutions, and together they began working on new propulsion systems that could revolutionize space travel. Jake was offered the position of Chief Navigation Instructor at the Galactic Naval Academy, and after thinking about it for several days he accepted because he realized that teaching other species would force him to. 3 weeks after the Horizon's successful passage through the void breach, Daniel stood in the docking bay and watched as 3 newly arrived ships from Earth approached the station, and these ships carried diplomats and scientists and cultural representatives who would establish formal relations between humanity and the dozens of species that had requested meetings and partnerships, and they also carried news from home about how the success had transformed life on every human colony. Story of the void breach had reached Earth faster than any physical ship could travel, and the transmission had been broadcast on every human world, and people who had felt isolated and forgotten suddenly had hope and pride and purpose, and children played games where they pretended to be the Horizon crew, and adults talked about the new opportunities that were opening, and governments began planning for a future where humanity was part of something larger than themselves. But the ships from Earth also brought something unexpected, and they carried volunteers who wanted to join the exploration and diplomatic corps and serve aboard ships like the Horizon, and the number of applications was overwhelming, and Daniel realized that what his crew had done was not just open trade routes, and it had opened the imagination of every human who dreamed of the stars. The diplomatic mission was scheduled to depart in 2 days, and the Horizon would carry ambassadors to 5 core worlds where humanity would establish embassies and formal relations, and the ship would be escorted by vessels from the Zenthari and Velthine and Corvani. And this escort was both an honor and a statement that humanity was now under the protection of the most powerful species in the galaxy. Lisa spent her last days at the station working with the Velthine engineers and finalizing the designs for a new propulsion system that combined human adaptive engineering with Velthine precision manufacturing, and the prototype would be built within 6 months, and if successful would reduce travel times between distant worlds by 40% and make exploration of previously unreachable regions possible. She was excited about the project but also nervous, because it meant she would be spending a year at the Velthine Research Institute away from the Horizon, and away from the crew that had become her family. And Nicole told her that this was exactly what they had fought for, and the chance for humans to work and learn throughout the galaxy, and that the crew would still be there when she returned. Jake had already begun working with the Galactic Naval Academy and was developing a new training program that combined human intuition with advanced computational methods, and his students were a mix of species and skill levels, and he found teaching more rewarding than he had expected, because each species brought different perspectives and different ways of thinking, and together they were creating navigation techniques that none of them could have developed alone. His first class included Thresh, the young Corvani pilot, and Jake saw in him the same natural talent and bold thinking that had helped them survive the void breach, and he made Thresh his teaching assistant, and together they were planning an expedition to map a previously unexplored region of space using the new navigation methods. Amy's research into gravitational patterns had attracted attention from the scientific community, and she was leading an international team that included some of the most brilliant minds from a dozen species, and they were working on a comprehensive model of gravitational phenomena that would revolutionize space travel and make it possible to predict and avoid dangerous regions that currently had to be navigated blindly or avoided entirely. Her team had discovered that the void breach was not unique, and that similar gravitational patterns existed in at least 15 other locations, and with proper understanding these regions could be traversed safely and open up new trade routes and exploration opportunities. And some of the regions led to parts of the galaxy that had never been visited by any known species. Kevin's medical techniques had been adopted widely, but he had also learned from alien medical practices and was developing hybrid treatments that combined the best of human and alien medicine. And he was particularly excited about a Xanthari technique for accelerated healing that, when combined with human stem cell research, could revolutionize trauma care across all species. He was planning to establish a joint medical research facility that would be staffed by doctors from multiple species and would serve as both a hospital and a training center, and the facility would be located on a neutral world and would treat anyone regardless of species or ability to pay. And Kevin saw this as the ultimate expression of medical ethics that transcended cultural boundaries. Nicole had been offered a position as first officer on one of the new exploration ships being built jointly by humans and aliens, but she had declined because she wanted to stay with the Horizon and with Daniel and continue the work they had started, and Daniel was grateful because he trusted her completely and knew that whatever challenges they faced, she would be there with solutions and support. The crew of the Horizon had changed in subtle ways since the void breach, and they moved with a confidence that came from having faced the impossible and survived, and they were no longer the uncertain colonists who had arrived at the station weeks ago, and they were now veterans who had earned their place among the stars through courage and innovation and blood. The council held a final ceremony before the diplomatic mission departed, and this ceremony was different from the formal verification, and it was a celebration of what had been accomplished and what the future might hold, and representatives from over 30 species attended, and many of them brought gifts and tokens of friendship and respect. The Xanthari presented Daniel with a crystal that their people gave to warriors who had demonstrated exceptional courage, and the crystal was carved with symbols that represented the fire that Quarren had spoken about, and it was one of the highest honors the Xanthari could bestow, and Daniel accepted it with genuine humility and pride. The Velthine gave the entire crew a detailed star map that included regions of space that were considered restricted information, and this sharing of knowledge was unprecedented and represented a level of trust that few species received, and the map would allow human explorers to navigate safely through areas that would have taken decades to chart otherwise. The Corvani presented Thresh with a ceremonial blade that had belonged to his ancestor, who died in the void breach 2 centuries ago, and the gesture was deeply symbolic because it meant that the Corvani believed the shame of that failure had been erased by humanity's success, and that their own courage had been reborn through witnessing what humans had accomplished. Other species brought gifts, ranging from practical tools to works of art to genetic databases that would benefit human medical research, and each gift represented a different aspect of the growing relationship between humanity and the galactic community. And Daniel realized that they had not just opened trade routes, and they had opened hearts and minds. The ceremony included speeches from various ambassadors and officials, and most of them talked about how humanity had changed their perspective and forced them to reconsider assumptions they had held for centuries, and some spoke about how their own species had become too cautious or too rigid, and how the human example had inspired them to embrace innovation and risk again. But the most moving speech came from an elderly Corvani admiral who had been in command when their ship was lost in the void breach, and she spoke about how that failure had haunted her people for 200 years, and how they had allowed fear to replace courage, and how watching the Horizon succeed had lifted a burden that had weighed on the Corvani spirit for generations. She thanked humanity not just for passing the trial, but for showing the galaxy that the impossible was just another challenge waiting to be overcome, and that innovation and courage were more valuable than any technology or ancient wisdom. And she declared that the Corvani were establishing a new military doctrine based on adaptive tactics and bold action, rather than careful planning and rigid protocols. Daniel listened to these speeches and felt the weight of responsibility, because humanity was now seen as an example and a standard, and other species were looking to them for inspiration and leadership, and he wondered if humans were ready for that role. But then he looked at his crew and saw in their faces the same determination and adaptability that had carried them through the void breach. The ceremony ended with a joint flyby where ships from multiple species flew in formation around the station, and the display was both beautiful and symbolic, because it showed species that had often been rivals working together in perfect coordination. And at the center of the formation was the horizon, looking small and battered, but carrying the hopes of an entire species. The final hours before departure were busy with last-minute preparations and final goodbyes, and Lisa was transferring to a Velthine research vessel that would take her to their institute, and Jake was staying at the station to continue his teaching, but promised to join them for a mission in 6 months. And Amy was dividing her time between the research station and field expeditions to study gravitational phenomena. Daniel spent time with each departing crew member and thanked them personally for what they had accomplished, and reminded them that no matter where they went, they would always be part of the Horizon crew.